Commander Zefak adjusted his primary viewing appendage and tried not to laugh. Well, not exactly laugh, since his species made more of a grinding sound when amused, but the sentiment was there. The holographic display in front of him showed the final roster for the Galactic Survival Championship, and honestly, this year's lineup was going to be a massacre. Attention, beings of the Federation, Zefak's voice echoed through the massive observation deck, where thousands of aliens from across the galaxy had gathered to witness what promised to be the most entertaining bloodbath in recent memory. Welcome to the 847th Annual Survival Challenge Tournament. The crowd erupted in various sounds that could generously be called cheering. Some species screeched, others vibrated their thoraxes, and the bloplings just sort of, blopped enthusiastically. This year's competition features 12 of the galaxy's most fearsome species, Zefak continued, pulling up the contestant profiles, fighting for ultimate bragging rights on the hell world of Xerion 7, where the weak go to die and the strong barely survive. The betting pools were already going insane. The Kroxxian warriors, with their natural armor plating and ability to regenerate limbs, were sitting pretty at 3-to-1 odds. The Velthari hunters, those six-legged nightmares with built-in thermal vision and retractable claws, weren't far behind at 4-to-1. Even the silicon-based rocklings were getting decent action at 12-to-1. Then there were the humans. Oh, sweet cosmic irony, the humans. Zefak had to grind his mandibles together to keep from making that embarrassing sound again. The human delegation consisted of 3 specimens that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of other, more successful species. Marcus Kane, a lanky creature with hair the color of dying vegetation. Elena Vasquez, a compact female who seemed to be made entirely of soft tissue and bad decisions. And Tommy Brooks, who honestly looked like he'd lose a fight with a particularly aggressive houseplant. And representing Earth, Zefak announced, barely containing his amusement, "We have the human team." The response from the crowd was, well, let's call it mixed. Some aliens actually felt bad for the poor things. Others were already calculating how quickly they'd be eliminated. The betting boards immediately updated the human odds to a laughable 847-to-1. Soft meat bags, someone muttered from the Kroxxian section. More like appetizers, added a Velthari with what passed for humor among her kind. This was going to be fun. 24 hours later, Zefak was beginning to think this tournament might actually be too easy. The transport pods had dumped all 12 teams onto Xerion 7's charming surface, and already the planet was living up to its reputation as a cosmic death trap. Current surface temperature, 47 degrees Celsius and climbing, announced his assistant, a nervous flibber named Kulix. Acidic precipitation expected within the next 2 hours. Oh, and the carnivorous flora has already claimed its first victim. Zefak's multiple eyes tracked across the monitoring screens. Poor Vorthak from the Silterian delegation had apparently mistaken a snapper vine for regular vegetation. The plant was currently digesting him with what could only be described as enthusiasm. The Silterian betting pool immediately went into panic mode. Well, that's 1 down, 11 to go, Zefak muttered, switching his attention to the more promising contestants. The Kroxxian team was performing exactly as expected. Their natural armor plating made them virtually immune to the acid rain that had started falling like clockwork. Vorthak the Destroyer was casually strolling through terrain that would melt lesser beings, occasionally pausing to crack rocks with his bare hands and consume the mineral content within. His teammate, Grax the Impaler, was busy intimidating some local wildlife into submission through pure physical presence. Now that's what I call natural selection at work, Zefak commented approvingly. The Kroxxian odds were looking better by the minute. The Velthari weren't disappointing either. Their enhanced sensory abilities meant they'd already mapped out safe zones, located fresh water sources, and identified which of the local creatures were edible versus which ones would eat them. Silas the Hunter was methodically tracking some kind of 6-legged deer analog, while her partner Nex had constructed what could generously be called a shelter from crystallized tree sap. Then there were the humans. Oh, the poor, confused humans. Are they broken? Helix asked, genuine concern in his voice as they watched the human team's initial response to their new environment. Marcus Kane, the apparent leader, was standing in the middle of the acidic drizzle. Not seeking shelter, not running for cover, just standing there. Water was literally running off his skin, and instead of looking concerned, he seemed almost pleased. Maybe their survival instincts are defective? Zefak suggested, watching as Elena Vasquez began collecting rocks. Not useful rocks, mind you, just random rocks. She was examining each one carefully, as if they held some secret that escaped the more advanced alien observers. Tommy Brooks was engaged in perhaps the most puzzling behavior of all. He was rubbing two sticks together, just rubbing them, repeatedly, with what appeared to be intense concentration. Sir Kulix's voice was getting higher with confusion. The human female is now licking stones. Sure enough, Elena had moved from collecting rocks to actually tasting them. The betting pools were going wild. Human odds had dropped to 1,247 to 1, and even those numbers seemed generous. Perhaps they're having some kind of species-wide mental breakdown? Zefak theorized. The stress of being dropped on a Deathworld might have triggered some kind of primitive regression. That theory seemed to hold water until Marcus Kane started running. Not running away from danger, not running toward shelter, just running. In circles. For no apparent reason. And here was the really weird part, he wasn't getting tired. How long has he been doing that? Zefak asked. 17 minutes and counting, sir. His core temperature should be reaching critical levels, but his biological readings are actually stabilizing. Meanwhile, Tommy Brooks had achieved something that defied all logical explanation. The two sticks he'd been rubbing together were now producing smoke. That's impossible, Helix whispered. Fire creation from friction requires precise technique, proper materials and apparently humans, Zefak finished, watching in growing bewilderment as actual flames began to appear. Maybe this tournament wouldn't be quite as predictable as he'd thought. By hour 6, Zefak was seriously considering filing a complaint with the Galactic Medical Association. Either the human monitoring equipment was completely malfunctioning, or these creatures were operating on biological principles that violated several universal constants. Sir, Marcus Kane has been running for 4 hours straight, Helix reported, his voice climbing into what could only be described as panic frequencies. He's been chasing that Xerion sprinter at a consistent pace of, well, it's barely faster than walking, but he just won't stop. On the main screen, they watched as the deer-like creature that had been effortlessly bounding away from the human finally stumbled. The poor thing looked back at Marcus with what Zefak could only interpret as existential confusion. Here was a predator that couldn't match its speed, couldn't match its agility, couldn't even match its natural weapons. But somehow, impossibly, it was still there. Still coming. Still running with that same steady, mechanical persistence. This makes no sense, Zefak muttered. The sprinters should be able to outrun any pursuit for days. Its cardiovascular system is specifically designed for. The sprinter collapsed. Marcus Kane walked up to it, barely breathing hard, and efficiently ended its suffering with a sharp rock. Then, and this was the part that made Zefak's brain hurt, he began the butchering process with techniques that suggested he'd done this before. Many times before. How is he not exhausted? Helix whispered. He's been running for hours in acidic rain and 40-degree heat. Look at his skin, Zefak said, zooming in on Marcus. He's leaking. Indeed, Marcus was covered in some kind of clear fluid that seemed to be evaporating off his body. Instead of overheating like any sensible creature would, he appeared to be cooling himself through this bizarre biological function. That's disgusting, Helix observed, and probably highly inefficient. Why would evolution design a cooling system that wastes so much water? Before Zefak could formulate a theory, their attention was drawn to Elena Vasquez, who had apparently decided to become a one-woman industrial revolution. The rocks she'd been collecting? They weren't random at all. She'd been selecting specific mineral compositions and was now using them to shape bones from Marcus's kill into what could only be described as tools. Actual tools. With edges. Sharp edges. She's making knives, Zefak said in disbelief. Fire from rocks and bones. How does she even know which stones will nap properly? Elena worked with the focused efficiency of a master craftsman, striking flakes off her selected stones with precise angles that suggested years of practice. Within 30 minutes, she'd produced a cutting implement that would have impressed even the Velthari weaponsmiths. Sir, Helix's voice was getting that strained quality again. Tommy Brooks has achieved sustained combustion. Tommy had indeed managed to coax his friction fire into a proper blaze, and was now feeding it with carefully selected materials that burned cleanly despite the planet's hostile atmosphere. But more importantly, he'd used the fire to begin smoking strips of meat from Marcus's kill. They're preserving food, Zefak realized. On day one, they're already thinking about long-term survival while everyone else is focused on immediate threats. The contrast with the other teams was becoming uncomfortably obvious. The Siltirian survivors, despite their impressive natural armor, were struggling with the planet's temperature fluctuations. The Bloplings had lost 2 members to acidic exposure. Even the mighty Kroxxians were starting to show signs of stress as their high metabolism bodies burned through their energy reserves. Update on current eliminations, Helix reported dutifully. The Xerion team is down to 1 member after an encounter with carnivorous moss. The Helix Collective lost their navigator to toxic spores. And the Bloplings, well, let's just say they're having structural integrity issues. Meanwhile, the humans seemed to be having what could only be described as a picnic. They'd constructed a surprisingly sophisticated shelter using techniques that appeared to involve actual engineering principles. Marcus had returned from another impossible hunting expedition with something that looked like a cross between a lizard and a bad decision. Elena had expanded her tool-making operation to include what appeared to be a primitive but functional workshop. Tommy was maintaining 3 separate fires for different purposes: cooking, signaling, and what might have been recreational warmth. I don't understand, Zefak admitted. Their biological readings show they should be suffering massive system failures. They're operating in conditions that would kill most known species, and they're thriving. Sir, there's something else, Helix added hesitantly. The other teams have started watching them. Indeed, several of the surviving alien contestants had positioned themselves within observation distance of the human camp. The Velthari hunter Silas was studying their fire-making techniques with obvious interest. One of the remaining Kroxxians kept glancing at their tool-making setup. Are the supposedly superior species learning from the humans? Zefak asked incredulously. The betting pools, meanwhile, had gone completely insane. Human odds had improved to a mere 200 to 1, and even those numbers were dropping fast. Something was very, very wrong with Zefak's understanding of evolutionary hierarchy. Hour 18 brought what the local meteorological systems cheerfully classified as a Class 7 atmospheric disturbance, which in plain language meant that Xerion 7 was about to throw a planetary tantrum that would make a supernova look like a gentle sneeze. All contestants, take cover immediately, Zefak broadcast across the emergency channels. We're tracking wind speeds approaching 200 kilometers per hour, with hailstones the size of Bloplings and enough electrical activity to power a small star destroyer. The response from the various teams was illuminating. The Kroxxians, despite their legendary toughness, immediately began searching for natural cave formations. The Velthari used their enhanced senses to locate underground burrows that might provide adequate protection. The surviving Siltirians started digging frantically with their natural excavation appendages. The humans, on the other hand, looked up at the approaching storm clouds and did something that made Zefak's primary brain hurt. They smiled. Are they experiencing some kind of neurological failure? Helix asked, watching as Marcus, Elena, and Tommy began moving with coordinated purpose. Their stress indicators should be off the charts, but they're actually showing decreased anxiety levels. What happened next would be replayed in Galactic Survival Academy training programs for the next 3 centuries. Within the span of 2 hours, while winds that could strip the armor off a Kroxxian warrior howled overhead, the human team constructed what could only be described as a masterpiece of emergency engineering. Using nothing but materials they'd gathered from their environment, they built a shelter that incorporated advanced concepts like load distribution, water channeling, insulation layering, and structural redundancy. How do they even know how to do this? Zefak demanded, watching through storm-shielded cameras as Elena calculated angles and stress points like she had a degree in xenoplanetary architecture. This isn't instinct, this is applied engineering. Tommy had created a ventilation system that maintained airflow without allowing the acidic precipitation inside. Marcus had constructed water collection and filtration systems that were already producing clean drinking water from the storm runoff. Meanwhile, Elena had fashioned what appeared to be a complete tool workshop, protected from the elements and organized with frightening efficiency. "Sir," Helix's voice was barely audible over the storm readings, "I'm getting structural integrity reports from the other teams." The news wasn't good. The Xerion's natural cave had flooded when they failed to account for water table changes. The Helix Collective's chosen shelter was experiencing catastrophic failure as winds exploited weaknesses in the rock formation they'd selected. 2 more bloplings had simply dissolved when their emergency burrow proved inadequate against the acidic precipitation. "And the favorites?" Zefak asked, though he was starting to suspect he didn't want to know. "Orthak the destroyer is showing signs of severe hypothermia. Apparently, his species' armor plating conducts heat too efficiently, and the temperature drop is causing system-wide failures. Grax the Impaler as well. He's trying to fight the storm, literally punching at wind currents." Zefak watched in horrified fascination as one of the most feared warriors in the galaxy stood in the middle of a death storm, throwing haymakers at atmospheric pressure. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so tragic. What about the Velthari? Silas the hunter made a critical error in plant identification. She consumed what she thought were nutrition-rich storm berries. They were actually Xerion death pods. Her enhanced metabolism is working against her now, processing the toxins faster than her natural immunity can handle. The betting pools were in complete chaos. Kroxxian odds had plummeted from 3-1 to 47-1 in the span of 6 hours. Velthari investments were being liquidated faster than their star hunter was processing deadly plant toxins. Meanwhile, human odds had inexplicably jumped to 15-1 and were still climbing. "This is impossible," Zefak muttered, switching between camera feeds that showed the storm's devastation. "Humans shouldn't be capable of this level of performance. They lack natural weapons, their sensory systems are substandard, their physical capabilities are mediocre at best, and their biology seems designed by committee." But there they were, not just surviving the storm, but using it. Marcus had positioned collection systems that were gathering materials blown in from across the continent. Elena was using the electromagnetic activity to test mineral samples in ways that suggested she understood principles of metallurgy that most species hadn't developed until they reached interstellar travel. Tommy had somehow managed to maintain their fires throughout the entire ordeal, using a combination of fuel management and airflow control that defied several laws of physics. "Sir, I'm reading something interesting from the human shelter," Helix reported, his voice filled with what could only be described as professional awe. "Internal temperature is holding steady at optimal levels. Humidity is controlled. Air quality is actually better inside their shelter than it was outside before the storm hit. They built a life support system," Zefak said slowly, "in 18 hours. On a Deathworld, using rocks and sticks. Sir, there's more. The other surviving contestants, they're heading toward the human shelter." On screen, Zefak could see the tragic procession. A severely weakened Kroxxian warrior, limping through the storm toward the impossible oasis of human engineering. A Silterian survivor, her natural digging claws worn to nubs, following the scent of dry warmth and clean air. Even a couple of bloplings, their structural integrity compromised but not yet fatal, rolling desperately toward the only shelter on the continent that seemed to understand the basic concept of not letting the environment kill you. Are they going to help them?" Helix asked. The answer came quickly. Marcus appeared at the shelter entrance, took one look at the desperate refugees from superior evolution, and began helping them inside. "They're rescuing the competition. Zefik said in disbelief. They're saving the lives of contestants who are supposed to be eliminating them. The human odds hit 8-1 and showed no signs of stopping. Day 3 dawned with what Zefik was beginning to recognize as typical human efficiency, quietly, methodically, and with an unsettling lack of drama. Of the original 12 teams, only 5 individuals remained alive. 3 humans, 1 Kroxxian, and a single Velthari who had somehow survived her poisoning through what the medical scanners were calling sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. Final challenge parameters are uploading now, Helix announced, though his voice had lost most of its earlier enthusiasm. Watching supposed apex predators get systematically outperformed by creatures that looked like they'd been assembled from discount biology parts had been somewhat demoralizing. Extraction Point Alpha is located 47.3 kilometers northeast of current position, Zefik broadcasted to the remaining contestants. Terrain includes acidic marshlands, thermal geysers, and what our geological teams have classified as aggressively unstable cliff formations. You have 18 hours to reach the extraction zone. Standard rules apply, first to arrive wins, but all survivors will be recovered. The response was immediate and telling. Grax the Impaler, the last remaining Kroxxian, let out a roar that probably registered on seismic equipment and began charging across the landscape like a living battering ram. His strategy appeared to be run in a straight line and punch anything that gets in the way, which had served his species well for millions of years of evolution. Next, the Velthari took a more measured approach, using her enhanced senses to plot the optimal route while maintaining her natural stealth capabilities. Despite her recent poisoning, she moved with the fluid grace of a born predator. The humans did something that made Zefik want to file a formal complaint with the universe itself. They had a meeting. They're strategizing, he said in disbelief. In the middle of a survival competition, with 18 hours to cross deadly terrain, they're having a tactical discussion. Sir, I'm picking up their conversation on audio, Helix reported. They're dividing their supplies. Indeed, Marcus, Elena, and Tommy were carefully redistributing their resources based on the upcoming terrain challenges. More importantly, they were doing it with the calm efficiency of beings who had been planning for this exact scenario since day 1. Notice anything interesting about their food stores? Zefik asked, pulling up the inventory scans. Helix's mandibles clicked in confusion, then realization. They still have 73% of their original supplies. The other contestants consumed their resources at nearly twice the rate. While Grax had gorged himself on early kills and Nex had burned through her emergency rations during the storm, the humans had been methodically rationing their food intake like they expected this competition to last weeks instead of days. Long-term thinking, Zefik muttered. They've been planning for the endgame since hour 1. The race itself was a masterclass in the difference between raw capability and applied intelligence. Grax maintained his early lead through pure physical dominance, smashing through obstacles that would stop lesser beings. Nex used her natural advantages to navigate hazards with minimal energy expenditure. The humans just kept going. Hour after hour, kilometer after kilometer, they maintained the same steady pace that had confused observers from day 1. When Grax's superhuman strength finally began to fail him in hour 12, the humans were still there, still moving, still functioning like biological machines designed specifically for this kind of punishment. How are they not exhausted? Helix demanded. Grax X twice their muscle mass and 3 times their theoretical endurance capacity. By hour 14, Nex was struggling. The residual toxins in her system, combined with the accumulated stress of 3 days of survival competition, were finally taking their toll. Her enhanced senses became a liability as overstimulation from the environment began causing system overloads. By hour 16, Grax collapsed. The mighty Kroxxian warrior, who could punch through solid rock and regenerate from wounds that would kill most species, simply ran out of fuel. His high metabolism biology, optimized for short bursts of incredible performance, had finally hit its limits. Medical emergency at grid reference 847 Alpha, Zefik announced. Contestant Grax is showing signs of complete metabolic failure. What happened next would become legendary in galactic survival circles. Marcus Kane, who should have continued toward the finish line and certain victory, stopped. He looked back at the fallen Kroxxian, had a brief conversation with his teammates, and made a decision that defied every principle of competitive survival. They went back. Elena fashioned an improvised stretcher using materials from her seemingly infinite toolkit. Tommy calculated load distribution and optimal carrying techniques. Marcus organized the entire operation with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Together, the three humans carried a 4000-kilogram unconscious Kroxxian warrior across 8.3 kilometers of hostile terrain, reaching the extraction point with 17 minutes to spare. "They won," Keelik said in a voice barely above a whisper. The humans won. But more than that, Zefak realized as he watched the medical teams attend to Grax and the still-recovering Nex, they had redefined what winning actually meant. The final betting payouts bankrupted half the observers in the arena. 3 days later, Commander Zefak sat in his private office and surrounded by holographic displays showing frame-by-frame analysis of what his senior staff had already started calling the Great Miscalculation. His career in survival entertainment spanned over 2 centuries, and he had never been so thoroughly, completely, and embarrassingly wrong about anything. "Computer, replay analysis segment 847 Alpha," he commanded, watching once again as Marcus Kane demonstrated what the xenobiology experts were now calling persistence hunting. Focus on cardiovascular efficiency during extended pursuit. The data was undeniable and frankly terrifying. While other species had evolved for short bursts of incredible performance, humans had somehow developed the biological equivalent of a fusion reactor. Their sweat-based cooling system, which had initially seemed like a design flaw, was actually the most efficient thermoregulation method in the known galaxy. They could literally run their prey to death while maintaining optimal operating temperature. Display tool creation analysis for Elena Vasquez, Zefak continued. The footage showed Elena transforming random environmental materials into sophisticated implements with techniques that suggested tens of thousands of years of evolutionary refinement. Not instinct-learned behavior passed down through countless generations of survivors who had conquered a planet that was actively trying to kill them. And fire creation capabilities for Tommy Brooks. Tommy's mastery over combustion wasn't magic or luck. It was the end result of a species that had harnessed the fundamental forces of chemistry before they'd even developed written language. They weren't just tool users, they were environmental engineers who could reshape their surroundings to suit their needs. Computer, display home planet classification for species designation human. The file that appeared made Zefak's breathing apparatus seize up. Earth wasn't just classified as a Deathworld, it was rated as a Class 12 hostile environment, the kind of planet that galactic civilization usually marked with warning beacons and quarantine protocols. Extreme weather patterns, aggressive fauna, volatile geology, and an atmosphere that was technically poisonous to most known life forms. "They're not from a nice planet that produced soft creatures," Zefak said aloud, finally understanding the magnitude of his error. "They're from a nightmare world that forged apex predators who look like prey." The betting scandal had already made galactic news. Several major gambling syndicates had declared bankruptcy. The Kroxxian Warriors Guild was demanding a formal review of their species' combat ratings. The Velthari Hunters Association had quietly begun studying human endurance techniques. But perhaps most telling was the message that had arrived that morning from the Galactic Survival Federation's Board of Directors, effective immediately. All future competitions will include a separate category for Deathworld species. We cannot, in good conscience, continue to allow what amounts to professional athletes to compete against amateur enthusiasts. Zefak leaned back in his chair and considered the implications. Humanity had been relegated to the galactic equivalent of amateur sports leagues for centuries, considered too primitive and fragile for serious competition. Meanwhile, they had been quietly developing capabilities that made them the most terrifying survival specialists in known space. "Sir?" Helix appeared in the doorway, holding a data pad. "The humans have submitted an application." "For what?" They want to know if we have any more challenging competitions available. Apparently, Xerion 7 reminded them of a place they call summer camp. Zefuk stared at the application for a long moment, then began drafting his resignation letter. Some things were simply beyond the scope of rational analysis. The humans had won more than a competition. They had fundamentally altered the galaxy's understanding of what survival actually meant.